Sir Hugh Dowding, known to history and later titled as the first Baron Dowding of Bentley Priory, first saw the light of day in the village of Moffat, situated roughly 50 miles to the south of Edinburgh, on April 24, 1882. Despite his Scottish birthplace, both of Dowding's parents were originally from the southern regions of England. Hugh's father, Arthur Dowding, descended from a family of clergymen in Wiltshire. Following his education at Winchester College, counted among England's most esteemed public schools, he pursued further learning at New College, Oxford, before embarking on a career as an educator. Arthur was employed as a teacher at Fettes College in Edinburgh, recognized as one of Scotland's most distinguished schools, when in 1879 he established St. Ninian's Boys' Preparatory School in Moffat. In 1880, Arthur entered into matrimony with Maud Tremenheere, daughter of Lieutenant General Charles Tremenheere, a military engineer with service in India. Hugh was destined to be the eldest of 4 offspring born to Arthur and Maud between the years 1882 and 1889. Subsequent to Hugh's arrival, a daughter named Hilda was born, followed by 2 additional sons, Arthur and Kenneth. In contrast to other boys from similar societal standing, the young Hugh Dowding was not dispatched to boarding school. Instead, he received his education at St. Ninian's under the tutelage of his father. Hugh later recounted that from an early age, he cultivated a tendency to question conventional wisdom, a trait that would contribute to him being a recalcitrant subordinate during his time in the military. In 1896, at the age of 14, Hugh concluded his studies at St. Ninian's and proceeded to Winchester College, where he remained for the subsequent 4 years. Unlike his father, who attained the position of prefect, Hugh did not distinguish himself academically at Winchester. His scholastic achievements were below average, and he also showed no particular talent in sports. He encountered notable difficulty with Greek and Latin, both being core subjects within the Victorian curriculum. Consequently, he could not emulate his father's path to the University of Oxford. Instead, he opted for a military profession and enrolled at the Royal Military Academy in Woolwich in September 1899. While his aspiration was to become a military engineer akin to his grandfather on his mother's side, his less than stellar examination outcomes resulted in Dowding being commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Royal Garrison Artillery in August 1900. The fledgling artillery officer was initially stationed at the Rock of Gibraltar, a strategically important British naval installation at that period, guarding the entrance to the Mediterranean. Towards the close of 1901, he received a transfer to Colombo, Ceylon, presently known as Sri Lanka, where he took up polo, a sport that would evolve into one of his cherished social activities. Some months afterwards, Dowding's unit relocated to Hong Kong, where he gained promotion to lieutenant in May 1902. Dowding subsequently recalled his period in Hong Kong with fondness, as it presented ample chances for polo, horse racing, and yachting. He was still stationed there when Japan initiated an assault on the Russian naval base of Port Arthur in Manchuria in February 1904, an event that signaled the commencement of the Russo-Japanese War, as the Japanese forces laid siege to Port Arthur, effectively trapping the Russian Pacific Fleet within the harbor. The Russians dispatched their Baltic Fleet on a global voyage to relieve the Pacific Fleet. During these unfolding events, British forces in Hong Kong were placed on high alert, owing to the British having entered into an alliance with the Japanese 2 years prior. Although they maintained neutrality until the Russian Baltic Fleet, having circumnavigated Africa to reach the Far East, was decimated by the Japanese at the Battle of Tsushima in May 1905, thereby concluding the war. In April 1904, the 22-year-old Dowding was reassigned to a mountain battery stationed near Rawalpindi in the Punjab region, situated in the northern part of the British Raj. He would spend the subsequent 6 years of his life in this mountainous region of northern India. There were numerous opportunities for polo and shooting, and despite the rainy conditions, he derived pleasure from being in the remote mountains. By 1910, the 28-year-old Dowding sought authorization to attend the British Army's Staff College at Camberley in Surrey. His commanding officers denied his request, and instead, he was transferred to an Indian battery at Dehradun, situated in the foothills of the Himalayas. Dowding later asserted that this posting was the most enjoyable phase of his military service. Nevertheless, in 1911, when his desire to return to England was granted, he departed and was soon admitted to Camberley, a few months shy of his 30th birthday, in January 1912. While at Camberley, Dowding held the view that his instructors were adhering too strictly to outdated military principles. From Lieutenant Dowding's perspective, his instructors at Camberley persisted in placing an excessive degree of confidence in the effectiveness of cavalry divisions, notwithstanding their evident susceptibility to contemporary machine gun and artillery fire. They also failed to fully recognize the potential military uses of the newly emerging airplanes, both for reconnaissance purposes and for offensive combat. During his tenure at the Staff College, Dowding's reserved demeanor earned him the moniker "Stuffy" amongst his peers, though this period also marked his inaugural visit to Switzerland with his family. It was during this trip he developed a lasting passion for skiing, later holding the position of president of the Ski Club of Great Britain in 1924 and 1925. In August 1913, marking precisely 13 years of military service, Dowding received a promotion to the rank of captain. To gain a more comprehensive grasp of the military capabilities of airplanes, Dowding undertook private flying lessons and secured his pilot's certificate on December 20th, 1913, coinciding with his graduation day from Camberley. Although his intention was to remain in the Army, in early 1914, he participated in a flying course at Upheaval in Salisbury, organized by the Royal Flying Corps, the British Army's aerial branch established in 1912. Over a 3-month duration, Dowding learned to operate increasingly advanced aircraft, including the BE-2C biplane. A brief assignment with a regiment on the Isle of Wight ensued for Dowding. However, the specter of war was rapidly rising on the European continent as a political crisis in the Balkans during June and July 1914 escalated into a continent-wide war in the closing days of July and the initial days of August 1914. Following years of mounting tensions among the major global powers concerning a range of issues from colonial competition to territorial disputes, the First World War, which now commenced, pitted Britain, France, and Russia against Germany, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire, alongside numerous lesser powers. With the outbreak of hostilities in August 1914, Dowding reported for duty to the RFC as a qualified pilot. His initial assignment involved aiding in the organization of 4 squadrons to support the British Expeditionary Force, dispatched across the English Channel to engage in combat against the German invasion of Belgium and France. In early October 1914, he joined the 6th Squadron as an observer and spent time airborne over Belgium and northern France, conveying his ground observations. At this initial phase of the war, all participating nations were primarily employing airplanes for reconnaissance missions, but this circumstance was poised to change as pilots began attaching weaponry to their aircraft. Before long, bombs were also being deployed from progressively larger and more sophisticated models. On November 29th, Dowding's squadron was restructured into Second Wing, with its base in Saint-Omer in Normandy. Shortly thereafter, Dowding transitioned into a fighter pilot role, and in early 1915, he received an appointment as a flight commander in Major Hubert Musgrave's 9th Squadron. This squadron was tasked with establishing communication with artillery batteries using wireless telegraphy, aiming to furnish real-time information regarding the precision of their artillery fire. Subsequent to Musgrave's return to Army duties, Dowding succeeded him as commander. Dowding's 9th Squadron comprised a proficient group of 14 pioneering officers, among whom 4, including Dowding himself, would eventually attain the rank of Air Marshal. However, by March 1915, the original squadron was disbanded, and the recently promoted Major Dowding assumed command of a reformed 9th Squadron, stationed at Brooklands Airfield in Surrey. Here, he became involved in experiments aimed at enhancing wireless communication systems. Despite Dowding having no pilots initially and being required to train 2 newly commissioned officers in flight, he benefited from the support of Charles Edmund Prince, formerly employed by the Marconi Company, a pioneer in telecommunications. To circumvent the delays associated with Army procurement protocols, Dowding and Prince visited Marconi's offices, where Dowding engaged the storekeeper in distracting conversations about aerial combat, while Prince discreetly acquired the necessary components for their experiments. Employing a superior valve, Prince constructed a radio set that was 4 times lighter than the standard model and boasted 4 times the operational range. Nevertheless, even after trials conclusively demonstrated the superior effectiveness of Prince's design, the War Office declined to adopt the new model. In July 1915, following 4 frustrating months contending with military bureaucracy, Dowding received orders to return to France to assume command of 16 Squadron. By the summer of 1915, the RFC had come to the realization that its aircraft were being outclassed by German planes, notably the Fokker E.13 monoplane, which possessed the capability to fire through its propeller arc. Military aviation was still in its nascent phase, and during the Battle of Loos in September 1915, Dowding found himself airborne with one of his pilots when ice began to accumulate on the wings, and the instruments started to malfunction. After deviating from their intended course and depleting their fuel supply, Dowding was fortunate to execute a landing within British lines. During Dowding's 6-month tenure as commander, 16 Squadron only succeeded in shooting down a single enemy aircraft, and Dowding's leadership style elicited mixed reactions among his subordinates. He was not a particularly skilled pilot and was infrequently in the air. His reserved manner maintained a distance from his junior officers, but he also improved the living standards for his pilots, refrained from attributing blame for crashes, and acknowledged that they were burdened with responsibilities beyond their training. In January 1916, Dowding returned to England and received a promotion to lieutenant colonel, concurrently assuming command of 7 Wing, based in Gosport in Hampshire. For a 6-month period, his responsibilities encompassed organizing defenses against nighttime raids from German Zeppelins, airships that were extensively deployed for bombing missions during the First World War. During this period, Dowding found himself with limited resources and only ambiguous directives from the War Office. He returned to France in June as commander of 9th Wing, which provided support for the Somme offensive, initiated on July 1st, 1916, one of the most extensive engagements of the entire war. The Royal Flying Corps suffered 545 casualties during the 6 months of the Battle of the Somme. Dowding's performance and leadership during this period might have been subject to scrutiny, but his primary endeavor was to introduce innovation in aerial tactics, a crucial undertaking in an era when aerial warfare was still in its evolutionary stages. Dowding was directed back to England in January 1918 to assume command of the Southern Training Brigade, operating from his headquarters in Salisbury in Wiltshire. Despite his promotions to colonel and subsequently to brigadier general in June, he did not witness further frontline combat during the First World War. When the RFC and the Royal Naval Air Service amalgamated to form the Royal Air Force, or RAF, in April 1918, Dowding was dispatched to York to fulfill an administrative role. He was stationed there when news of the armistice and the German surrender arrived in November 1918, the German economy having effectively collapsed under the strains of war against Britain, France, and from April 1917, the United States. With the cessation of hostilities, the Air Force underwent significant downsizing. Even amidst demobilization, Dowding was appointed as a group captain on August 1, 1919, acting on the counsel of Dowding's commanding officer, Sir Vial Vivian. His personal life was also undergoing changes. In February 1918, Dowding married Clarice Maud Vancourt, whose cousin Major John Beck had served as Dowding's commanding officer during his time in 6th Squadron back in 1914. Clarice, the widow of a British Army officer who had perished in an accident prior to the war, already had a daughter from her prior marriage. In January 1919, a son named Derek was born to them. He would later become a fighter pilot in the Second World War. Dowding was deeply saddened when Clarice passed away suddenly on June 28, 1920, just over 2 years into their marriage. He would not remarry until much later in his life. The bereavement of his wife and the responsibility of organizing air pageants at RAF Hendon in North London precipitated Dowding into a condition of physical and mental exhaustion in the early 1920s. The air shows attracted tens of thousands of attendees, including royalty and prominent figures from social and political circles, and served as the RAF's most effective means of advocating against its dissolution, which was being championed by influential Army and Navy officers as well as government officials who contended that its upkeep was excessively expensive, now that the war had concluded. For his efforts in orchestrating mock aerial combat and bombing demonstrations, Dowding was promoted to Air Commodore in January 1922. In September 1924, he received an overseas posting as Chief Staff Officer at the headquarters of the RAF's Iraq Command in Baghdad. Britain had assumed control of Iraq as a mandate on behalf of the League of Nations following the defeat of the Ottoman Empire in the First World War. Air power was deemed a cost-effective strategy for maintaining control over the region compared to deploying and sustaining large ground forces, especially in the sparsely populated desert expanses of Mesopotamia. Dowding was soon recommended for appointment to the position of Director of Training at the Air Ministry from May 1926, where his brother Arthur was serving as the Royal Navy's liaison officer. In this capacity, Dowding overcame local resistance and facilitated the establishment of 4 bombing ranges. In recognition of his contributions, he was promoted to the rank of Air Vice Marshal in 1929. In September, Dowding received directives to assume overall command of the British military presence in 1929, Palestine and Transjordan, where conflicts between Arabs and Jews had escalated in another British mandate, compelling the British government to augment its forces in the region during the interwar period. Following aerial and ground inspections of the region, Dowding concluded that the British should enhance efforts to ensure Jewish security, but also that the British should refrain from imposing a Jewish state in Palestine without concurrently honoring promises of self-governance made to the Arabs in 1916. By the time Dowding returned to England in December, the situation in Palestine had become comparatively calm, though this tranquility was not destined to endure. Upon his return to Britain, Dowding would dedicate the ensuing decade of his life to enhancing Britain's air defense capabilities. During the First World War, Britain had been subjected to attacks from German Zeppelin airships and Gotha bombers, resulting in hundreds of casualties. Although these figures would be overshadowed by German bombing campaigns in the subsequent generation during the Second World War, the inability to prevent enemy aircraft from arriving undetected to destroy vital infrastructure and inflict casualties on innocent civilians triggered political unrest. In his role as First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill bore political responsibility for air defense and recognized the imperative for an integrated air defense system encompassing anti-aircraft guns, searchlights, balloons, aircraft, and coastal observers. The RFC had already established a distinct home defense wing in 1916. However, it was only when Major General Edward Ashmore of the RFC assumed unified command of air defense that Britain's armed forces developed a coordinated approach. Under Hugh Trenchard, the RFC, and subsequently the RAF, adopted the principle that effective air defense was contingent upon offensive capabilities, and that bombing raids directed against the enemy not only acted as a deterrent, but also bolstered morale domestically. After the conclusion of the First World War, much of Ashmore's air defense infrastructure was dismantled. Yet the British government, mindful of the potential for future conflict, established Air Defense Great Britain in 1925, comprising 35 bomber squadrons and 17 fighter squadrons. In the same year, the Home Office initiated an Observer Corps, predominantly composed of unpaid volunteers staffing a network of observation posts across southeastern England, equipped with telephones. This organization came under RAF control in 1929, coinciding approximately with Dowding's return to England from the Middle East. he took command of Air Defense's fighter aircraft upon his return. He later recalled the absurd nature of training exercises, during which he challenged the RAF's preference for bomber aircraft by instituting an early warning system to enable his fighters to become airborne and intercept the incoming bombers. He then instructed one of his fighters to shadow the bombers back to their base and transmit a signal to his colleagues to decimate them on the ground while they were refueling, thereby illustrating that bomber aircraft without adequate fighter escort would be swiftly neutralized in actual warfare. In August 1930, Dowding was promoted to the Air Council of the Air Ministry, the RAF's governing body, serving as the officer with specific responsibility for supply and research. Early in his tenure, he granted airworthiness approval to the R-101, a naval airship that tragically exploded following a crash in France on its maiden voyage in early 2007 October, resulting in the deaths of 48 out of the 54 individuals on board, including Lord Thompson of Cardington, the Secretary of State for Air in the British government. Dowding possessed limited experience with airships and later conceded that although he had participated in a 16-hour trial flight, he'd been excessively inclined to accept overly optimistic technical assessments of their safety without demanding further trials. An inquiry into the crash deliberately avoided assigning explicit blame to any individual, allowing Dowding to retain his position. But in the aftermath of the tragedy, Dowding resolved to personally conduct tests on new equipment henceforth, rather than simply accepting expert opinions. Throughout the 1930s, the British political and military establishment were intensely focused on averting the recurrence of hostilities following the devastation of the First World War. This sentiment extended to prohibitions on certain modalities of aerial warfare. For example, the British government unsuccessfully pursued an international accord to outlaw aerial bombardment through the League of Nations. However, by the latter half of the decade, this objective was proving unattainable. Although Germany had been prevented by the Treaty of Versailles from possessing an air force, its fascist leader from early 1933, Adolf Hitler, disregarded this restriction, and a new German Luftwaffe was being developed from 1935 onward under the direction of Hermann Göring, a high-ranking Nazi minister. Initially, Britain and France opted to overlook this development, hoping that the Luftwaffe would remain a modest air force. Nevertheless, as the years progressed and as Germany commenced annexing portions of Central Europe, such as Austria and the Sudetenland, in contravention of the stipulations of the Treaty of Versailles of 1919, there were escalating calls for the expansion of the Royal Air Force, notably from figures such as Winston Churchill, who cautioned that German bombing raids could potentially result in tens of thousands of civilian deaths within a single week. Although Churchill's warnings were initially dismissed as excessively alarmist, the RAF acknowledged that the failure of air defense could precipitate German invasion and occupation. For the subsequent years, the RAF concentrated on maintaining or regaining numerical parity with German aircraft, albeit while sustaining a greater emphasis on bombers over fighters. Simultaneously, British air defenses, which had previously been oriented towards France, were now redirected eastward towards Germany. Dowding, who had been promoted to full air marshal in January 1933 and knighted in June, recognized that Britain's air defenses were inadequate to counter the German threat, and that British fighters lacked sufficient time to ascend and engage German bombers before they initiated their attacks. An RAF exercise in August 1934 revealed that, under specific conditions, Britain's air defenses were vulnerable to incursions by a meager enemy force comprising as few as 5 bombers. Consequently, Dowding was appointed to a subcommittee of the Committee of Imperial Defense, focusing on air defense. One of his preliminary recommendations was the replacement of outdated wooden biplanes with contemporary monoplanes constructed with metal airframes. Following extensive observation of aircraft and weaponry trials, Dowding concluded that British military aircraft were lagging behind those of continental European powers and proposed that the Air Council should establish a novel position exclusively dedicated to research and development. In January 1935, Dowding himself was appointed to this position, relinquishing his responsibilities for supply and organization. Dowding advocated for the production of fighter aircraft equipped with 8 machine guns mounted on the wings, capable of firing 1,000 rounds per minute. He was therefore instrumental in the development of the Hawker Hurricane, which first entered operational service in December 1937 and would become the most effective British fighter aircraft of the Second World War. The Supermarine Spitfire followed in August 1938. While the former was more economical to manufacture and simpler to repair, the latter possessed superior technical specifications, but a shorter operational range. By the commencement of the Second World War in September 1939, 18 squadrons were equipped with Hurricanes and 9 with Spitfires. To augment wartime production capacity, Dowding executed procurement agreements with automobile manufacturers to produce components for military aircraft. A rearmament initiative adopted in 1935 envisioned an expansion of air defense to encompass 70 bomber and 35 fighter squadrons. And in July 1936, Air Defense of Great Britain was divided into Bomber Command under Sir John Steele and Fighter Command under Dowding. This division testified to the prevailing belief that Dowding possessed unparalleled expertise in Britain concerning fighter aircraft and their wartime deployment. Dowding and fellow RAF officers acknowledged that effective air defense necessitated an early warning system to enable fighters to react to enemy bomber missions before their planes penetrated English airspace. In January 1935, Robert Watson Watt of the National Physical Laboratory produced a report suggesting the feasibility of detecting and locating aircraft using electromagnetic radiation waves. Following a trial in February that demonstrated the detection of an aircraft at a range of 8 miles, Dowding consented to provide funding for further research into radar, an acronym for radio detection and ranging, after assuming leadership of Fighter Command. In 1936, Dowding and RAF scientist Henry Tizard ensured that radar technology was integrated into the air defense system, enabling Fighter Command's aircraft to position themselves to confront approaching enemy aircraft. This innovation revolutionized fighter tactics, eliminating the requirement for continuous airborne patrols. By April 1939, 11 operational radar stations provided coverage along almost the entirety of Britain's east coast. Dowding's headquarters as head of Fighter Command were located at Bentley Priory, an 18th-century country residence near Stanmore, situated to the northwest of London. On New Year's Day 1937, Dowding was promoted to Air Chief Marshal, equivalent to the rank of full general. In February 1937, he experienced disappointment upon learning that he had been passed over for promotion to Chief of the Air Staff, the highest post in the RAF. However, his spirits were elevated in June when he was awarded the Grand Cross of the Royal Victorian Order by King George VI during the Hendon Air Show. Equipped with his extensive experience in the study of air defense, Dowding set about constructing communication systems to guarantee his access to information from radar stations and observation posts. Operation rooms were established at Bentley Priory and airfields across the country, displaying the positions of both friendly and hostile aircraft plotted on maps, based on the most current data from radar stations and the Observer Corps. While Dowding recognized the necessity of delegating tactical command to his subordinates, he retained complete control over the radar system, and Bentley Priory functioned as a central point to filter information from radar and observers to his sector commanders. As late as 1937, the RAF and Luftwaffe were still engaged in reciprocal visits of air officers, and when the Luftwaffe's second-in-command Erhard Milch visited Bentley Priory in October, he dispensed with formalities and directly inquired of Dowding about the progress he was making with his radio detection system. While Dowding maintained his characteristic composure, several of his fellow officers exhibited signs of unease. Milch then informed Dowding that the Luftwaffe was actively developing its own radar system and expressed confidence that the Germans would prevail in this technological race. Although Milch's prediction would prove inaccurate, Dowding still confronted several challenges before radar could be effectively utilized by his fighters. It was only in March 1939 that scientists devised an identification device to differentiate friendly aircraft from enemy aircraft. And by October 1940, virtually every RAF aircraft was equipped with this technology. In early 1937, Dowding formulated a comprehensive air defense strategy, one that necessitated 45 fighter squadrons, 1,200 heavy anti-aircraft guns, and up to 5,000 searchlights. Dowding contended that while offensive capabilities were essential for achieving victory in war, effective air defense was indispensable for ensuring Britain's survival against enemy attacks and providing the necessary time to prepare for offensive operations. The RAF's inclination towards bombers was partly driven by a desire to persuade the government that air power alone could secure victory in its competition with the Army and Navy for defense funding. In mid-1937, the Air Ministry determined that over 1,400 bombers were required to effectively confront the Luftwaffe, but only approximately 500 fighters. However, by late 1937, Sir Thomas Inskip, the Minister for Coordination of Defense, convinced Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain that defense should take precedence over offense, acknowledging that Britain's aircraft production capacity could not match Germany's in the short to medium term, and that fighters were more cost-effective to produce than bombers. Despite a succession of increasingly ambitious rearmament programs from the mid-1930s, even after the Hurricane and Spitfire entered service in 1938, the fighter aircraft under Dowding's command were still predominantly biplanes, and it was not until 1939 that Hurricanes and Spitfires were manufactured in substantial quantities. Dowding's endeavors were further hampered by disagreements concerning tactics. He held the belief that the most efficacious tactic for fighter aircraft was to pursue enemy bombers and engage them from the rear. But several of his colleagues, including Sholto Douglas, the Assistant Chief of the Air Staff, favored two-seater fighters like the Bolton Paul Defiant. The Defiant featured a 4-gun turret at the rear, but no forward-firing armament, compelling the pilot to fly ahead of the enemy to enable his gunner to engage, with both crew members unable to coordinate effectively or assist each other amidst combat. In June 1938, Dowding was dismayed when Douglas mandated that he equip 9 of his 38 squadrons with Defiants. When war erupted in September 1939, Dowding exerted every effort to restrict the utilization of Defiants to training purposes. He also initiated an effort at this time to equip fighter aircraft cockpits with bulletproof windscreens. When he encountered incredulous laughter, he questioned, "If Chicago gangsters can equip their vehicles with bulletproof glass, why can't my pilots have bulletproof windscreens?" Subsequent evaluations demonstrated that the added mass of the bulletproof glass presented no issue and would considerably lessen casualties. Dowding also needed to persuade the Air Ministry that his aircraft necessitated all-weather, durable runways. When Air Ministry officials posited that paved runways were challenging to conceal and would constitute conspicuous targets for enemy bombing raids, Dowding informed them that it was of greater importance for his pilots to take off and land swiftly and securely, and that any endeavors to disguise landing strips would likely disorient British pilots as much as the adversary. Although Dowding would ultimately prevail in this debate, construction work advanced at such a sluggish pace that merely a solitary airfield possessed all-weather runways by the time hostilities commenced in September 1939. In October 1938, Neville Chamberlain convened with Hitler in Munich alongside the French and Italian leaders, Édouard Daladier and Benito Mussolini. There, they consented to the German annexation of the German-speaking Sudetenland region in Czechoslovakia, situated along the German border, in exchange for an assurance from the Nazis to halt further territorial expansion. While Chamberlain's assertion of having secured peace in our time would prove tragically misguided, at that juncture, Britain was in no position to engage in war. Despite the British government having prioritized the RAF over the Navy and Army, the majority of Fighter Command's 500-plus aircraft were outdated, while Bomber Command possessed few planes capable of reaching Germany. For a number of years, Dowding had harbored skepticism regarding the Air Ministry's assumptions concerning the impact of bombing raids. In July 1938, He orchestrated a test wherein he dispersed 30 obsolete biplanes across Salisbury Plain as targets for bombers. Following a week of bombing exercises, 26 of the aircraft remained in airworthy condition. While these outcomes instilled in Dowding a belief that his fighters were not as susceptible to enemy bombing as RAF doctrine suggested, he persisted in bolstering Fighter Command's capabilities until his scheduled departure from his position in July 1939. Ultimately, Dowding's tenure was prolonged when his designated successor, Sir Christopher Courtney, sustained injuries in an accident. Subsequently, the Second World War erupted in September 1939 when Germany invaded Poland. Britain and France responded by declaring war on the Nazi regime. Britain was powerless to prevent the rapid conquest of Poland, but minor Luftwaffe raids over the English Channel were occurring in the 8 months spanning from September 1939 to May 1940. This interval afforded Dowding valuable time to refine his air defense system, both on the ground and in the air. In May 1940, Germany finally launched its invasion of the Low Countries and France. It proved to be a calamitous situation from an aerial standpoint. Almost immediately, the Luftwaffe decimated a significant portion of the French Air Force on the ground, while German tanks advancing through the Low Countries into northern France ensured that the French armies on the eastern frontier could not react in time. On May 16th, Dowding penned a pivotal letter to the Air Ministry, articulating that he possessed only 36 of the 52 squadrons he deemed necessary for the effective defense of British airspace, and that he could not allocate any additional squadrons to support operations in France. While Winston Churchill, who had assumed the role of British Prime Minister in early May 1940, after years of issuing warnings about German intentions, concurred with the decision not to dispatch further fighter squadrons to France, the RAF was compelled to operate from British airfields to facilitate the evacuation of Allied troops from Dunkirk towards the end of May. Dowding entrusted tactical command to Air Vice Marshal Keith Park, a New Zealander who had served as his deputy at Fighter Command until April 1940. As commander of No. 11 Group, encompassing southeast England, Park was allocated 16 squadrons to furnish air cover. By the time the evacuation concluded on June 4th, 340,000 Allied personnel had been rescued. Fighter Command had incurred losses of over 400 Spitfires and Hurricanes in France, although the RAF played a frequently underestimated role in the Dunkirk evacuation. Had it not been for the aerial protection they provided, the Luftwaffe would have sunk considerably more vessels to the seabed of the English Channel. By July 1940, with France entirely subjugated, German attention turned to eliminating Britain from the war. Hitler aspired to defeat Britain without resorting to an island invasion, instead employing a combination of naval and air power to compel the British to surrender by disrupting their shipping lanes and subjecting their cities to intense bombardment. By the time the Luftwaffe initiated its initial major assaults on London in early July 1940, Dowding was slated to relinquish his command of Fighter Command within days. Although Churchill held Dowding in high esteem and believed he should not be replaced during the war, it was not until August 1940 that Air Minister Archibald Sinclair informed Dowding that he would remain in his position. Despite Dowding's extensive preparations, the RAF appeared to be the less favored combatant against the Luftwaffe. When the Battle of Britain commenced on July 10th, 1940. In contrast to the often farcical RAF training exercises, Luftwaffe pilots had acquired combat expertise supporting General Francisco Franco's nationalists in the Spanish Civil War between 1936 and 1939, and had proven devastatingly effective in the campaign against France. While Dowding had formulated his plans based on the premise that the Luftwaffe would need to operate from bases in Germany, the swift collapse of France enabled the German Air Force to launch attacks on Britain from a much closer proximity on the opposite side of the English Channel. However, Dowding did benefit from several other crucial advantages over his adversary. While the Luftwaffe initially enjoyed numerical superiority, by 1940, British factories were producing nearly 500 fighters per month, compared to fewer than 200 in Germany. where there was an increasing emphasis on bomber aircraft. The surge in British aircraft production was largely attributable to Lord Beaverbrook, the newspaper proprietor whom Churchill had appointed Minister of Aircraft Production and who was among Dowding's advocates within the government. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe lacked a heavy strategic bomber capable of inflicting the scale of devastation Hitler demanded, and its fighter planes, primarily the Messerschmitt Bf 109, were less maneuverable than the Hurricane and Spitfire. The fact that the British possessed these technological advantages by 1940 was a direct consequence of the innovations Dowding had introduced throughout the 1930s. Although Dowding was concerned about the losses sustained in France, the RAF had performed commendably, and during the 6-week campaign, the Luftwaffe had lost over 1,200 aircraft. Nevertheless, Dowding was relieved that the Luftwaffe did not initiate a full-scale attack on Britain until July. The Luftwaffe had over 1,300 bombers and 1,000 fighters at its disposal by that time, including approximately 750 Messerschmitt Bf 109s, while Dowding commanded 450 Hurricanes and 300 Spitfires. In Dowding's assessment, he needed to prevent the Luftwaffe from attaining air superiority for the ensuing 3 or 4 months, until the advent of inclement weather in winter across the English Channel would impede German aerial plans. Subsequently, by late spring and summer of 1941, Britain's air defense would be significantly strengthened, and there was anticipation that the United States would join Britain in the war. Dowding delegated tactical command to 4 group commanders: Keith, Parks, number 11. Group in the southeast was assigned 23 squadrons. Sir Quintin Brand's number 10 group covered the southwest with 10 squadrons. Trafford Lee Mallory's number 12 groups, 14 squadrons were tasked with East Anglia and the Midlands, while Richard Saul's 13 group had his 14 squadrons distributed in an arc from Northern Ireland through Scotland to Newcastle. Although the designation had been coined by Churchill in a parliamentary address on June 18th, the Battle of Britain was more accurately a campaign comprising several distinct phases. Between July 10th and August 11th, 1940, the Luftwaffe's primary objectives were shipping and naval facilities in the English Channel and along the southern coastline of England. These targets were situated very close to France, and radar stations could not detect enemy aircraft sufficiently in advance before they struck. Consequently, Dowding was compelled to maintain standing air patrols during this initial stage of the Battle of Britain. This strategy resulted in veteran pilots becoming exhausted and susceptible to errors, but Dowding was hesitant to substitute seasoned fighters with newly trained recruits. To conserve his limited resources, Dowding deemed a single squadron of 12 fighters adequate to engage each enemy formation. Over the course of the month, the RAF lost 178 aircraft, including over 100 fighters lost to enemy action, along with a substantial number due to accidents, particularly during nighttime flying attempts. Nevertheless, the Luftwaffe suffered losses exceeding 300 planes, granting the RAF a nearly 2-to-1 ratio in terms of casualties inflicted. Despite inflicting greater damage upon the enemy and with the rate of British aircraft production gradually diminishing German numerical superiority, Dowding lamented the loss of hundreds of experienced pilots. While he was pleased to utilize a small contingent of French, Dutch, and Belgian pilots from the foreign resistance movements that had formed in London, he was more reluctant to integrate Polish and Czech pilots within the RAF, and a separate Polish Air Force was instead established in Britain. Nonetheless, by September, Dowding had become convinced that the Poles and Czechs were among the most courageous and proficient of his pilots. During a dinner with Churchill, when the Prime Minister expressed his view that 1 Pole was equivalent to 3 Frenchmen, Dowding suggested that 10-to-1 was a more accurate assessment. On August 12th, having been instructed to swiftly achieve air superiority over the RAF, Göring's Luftwaffe commenced targeting RAF airfields in England. Dowding hoped that his planes would be able to become airborne to confront the enemy before they reached their targets. Although the air bases in Kent, closest to France, struggled to react in time to radar warnings. Fighter Command sustained its record of downing 2 enemy aircraft for each aircraft lost. Success in the southeast prompted Goring to dispatch a fleet of bombers from Scandinavia in a diversionary attack on northern England on August 15th. Number 13 Group responded effectively to the threat, and the German bombers were repelled with significant losses. The following day, Churchill visited one of the RAF headquarters at Uxbridge, while Number 11th Group was addressing multiple waves of Luftwaffe attacks. Upon his departure, Churchill remarked, "Never in the field of human conflict has so much been owed by so many to so few," a statement he reiterated in Parliament 4 days subsequently. On August 24th, the Luftwaffe altered its tactics by deploying a larger quantity of smaller formations, with bombers shielded by close escorts. By early September, Fighter Command had shot down almost 750 enemy aircraft and lost close to 500 fighters, and Dowding continued to grapple with the challenge of replacing fallen pilots. On September 7th, 1940, Dowding conveyed his concerns regarding pilot replacements to Sholto Douglas, who was fulfilling many of the responsibilities of Chief of the Air Staff. But the latter failed to grasp Dowding's insistence that men were trained not solely to fly, but also to engage in combat. During this meeting, the Luftwaffe launched a massive raid on London, deploying 348 bombers escorted by 617 fighters. This initiated a new phase of the Battle of Britain as the Luftwaffe abandoned its focus on diminishing RAF assets and began targeting the city of London, hoping to demoralize the British populace and force its surrender. Between September 7th and November 12th, the Luftwaffe launched nearly 60 major nighttime bombing raids against the British capital. Dowding's system was not designed for nighttime combat, and the RAF would not develop an effective night fighter plane until the introduction of the Bristol Beaufighter in March 1941. Dowding's radar stations were all oriented towards the coastline, and the Observer Corps proved ineffective at spotting enemy planes at night, compelling Dowding to hastily establish radar stations further inland. The RAF was under political pressure to take action in response to the raids on London, and Douglas proposed assigning more Hurricanes for night fighting, overruling Dowding's objections that they were ineffective without airborne radar systems, which were not yet available. London endured immense suffering during the Blitz, though it would have been significantly worse were it not for the preventative measures undertaken by the RAF. Fighter Command's most significant triumph occurred on September 15th, when the Luftwaffe sustained 175 casualties compared to 12 killed and a further 12 wounded for the RAF. Around this period, Hitler acknowledged that Operation Sea Lion, his projected amphibious invasion of England, had to be postponed as the aerial and naval campaigns had not achieved sufficient success. Despite Dowding's success in withstanding successive waves of attacks from the Luftwaffe, his leadership of Fighter Command came under criticism from several subordinates. Trafford Leigh-Mallory, commander of No. 12 Group, was dissatisfied with his relegation to a supporting role to Park's No. 11th Group. In his endeavor to secure a more prominent role, Leigh-Mallory championed Douglas Bader's big wing theory. A brilliant pilot, Bader had returned to flying after losing both his legs in a 1931 accident, utilizing sheer upper body strength to operate his prosthetic legs to manipulate a custom-fitted set of pedals. By September 1940, he was leading one of No. 12 Group's squadrons based at Duxford in Cambridgeshire. Eager for greater involvement, Bader proposed a large formation of 3 squadrons from No. 12 Group to take off immediately upon receiving notification that the enemy was organizing a raid, aiming to intercept the enemy at a high altitude, with 11 Group in support. Without any substantiating evidence, Bader claimed to Leigh-Mallory that he had employed these tactics to repulse 100 enemy aircraft with only 10 Hurricanes. On September 17th, Leigh-Mallory reported to Dowding on further successes achieved by big wing formations, while Park was willing to permit squadrons from No. 12 Group to relieve depleted squadrons of his No. 11 Group. Air Ministry officials endorsed big wing instead. Despite Bader's assertions, The larger wings required more time to assemble, and on several occasions, the British fighters were not in position to confront German attacks. In October, Dowding attended a conference to discuss fighter tactics, where he and Park were opposed by Leigh-Mallory and Bader. Sholto-Douglas appeared determined to disregard Dowding's objections and ruled in favor of Big Wing. On October 13, 1940, Hitler announced that Operation Sea Lion would be postponed until the following spring. But it was not until December that the plans were completely abandoned. Meanwhile, the nighttime bombing raids persisted with considerable intensity. Thanks to Dowding's efforts in establishing an integrated air defense system encompassing radar, the observer corps, radio communications, operations rooms, anti-aircraft guns, and Hurricanes and Spitfires, Fighter Command ensured Britain's survival in the Second World War, and Dowding had shattered the Luftwaffe's aura of invincibility. While Fighter Command's successful defense of Britain from Nazi invasion in the summer and autumn of 1940 ranks alongside the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 and Horatio Nelson's victory at Trafalgar in 1805 in the annals of British military glory, its primary architect was soon demoted. Dowding's stances on night fighting and his opposition to Big Wing placed him at odds with what squadron leader Peter Brown termed a cabal of politicians and senior officers at Air Ministry, which included Sholto-Douglas and two retired chiefs of the Air Staff, Hugh Trenchard and Sir John Salmond. Although Dowding continued to dedicate himself to addressing the night defense issue, his reluctance to endorse any proactive operations until an effective night fighter became available encouraged his detractors to take action against him. On November 13th, Archibald Sinclair informed Dowding that he was to lead a mission to the United States to procure new aircraft and equipment. Dowding was hesitant to depart from Fighter Command, but he accepted the new assignment after meeting Churchill the following day. He departed Fighter Command a week and a half later and was succeeded by Sholto-Douglas, while Keith Park was dismissed as commander of No. 11th Group and replaced by his rival Leigh-Mallory. While Dowding's removal from his position at Fighter Command has become a subject of historical debate, there were compelling reasons for Dowding to step down. He was 58 years old and was evidently exhausted by the immense strain he had endured through the battles of France and Britain. While the strategic approach to the war was evolving as the immediate threat of a German invasion receded, a devastating raid on Coventry on November 14th had also claimed the lives of 1,800 civilians, convincing Churchill that a leadership change at the apex of Fighter Command was necessary. Yet, as Dowding had foreseen, the new leadership also proved incapable of effectively countering nighttime raids. On the night of May 10th, 1941, and into the early hours of the 11th, over 500 German bombers assaulted London in one of the largest aerial bombardments of the entire war. An attack undoubtedly timed by the Germans to commemorate the one-year anniversary of Churchill's appointment as Prime Minister. This resulted in over 3,000 civilian casualties. It was, however, the final major raid on England by the Luftwaffe, which was subsequently redirected eastward to support Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941. Dowding crossed the Atlantic by sea in late December 1940 and met with Canadian and American dignitaries in January 1941. Although he was not a natural diplomat, Dowding created a positive impression and made certain to commend the American aircraft in service with the RAF. He was impressed by American navigational technology and secured an order for airborne radar, while dedicating much of his time to touring airfields and factories and delivering lectures on fighter combat and the war in general. While Dowding's general impressions of American aircraft production were favorable, he reported to Beaverbrook that the American Air Force lacked combat experience and that their planes were deficient in armor protection. Dowding's time in North America proved to be short-lived, as he had a disagreement with the new British ambassador to Washington, Lord Halifax, Chamberlain's controversial foreign secretary who had proposed exploring peace initiatives while serving in Churchill's war cabinet. While Halifax encouraged Americans to contribute to the RAF Benevolent Fund, Dowding objected to this and believed it was demeaning to solicit American donations. Halifax contended that Dowding's blunt manner was undermining British foreign policy and requested Churchill to recall Dowding. While Churchill and Beaverbrook initially hoped that Dowding would remain in America, Dowding himself desired to return to Britain. In April, Dowding was developing plans to transport American airmen to Britain and decided to test the concept by making the journey home in a converted bomb bay in early May. Despite malfunctions with the oxygen supply and the heating, Dowding survived to recount the ordeal. Over the ensuing months, Churchill proposed various positions to Dowding, including governor of southern Rhodesia, modern-day Zimbabwe, but Dowding either declined or faced opposition from the Air Ministry. When a pamphlet concerning the Battle of Britain was published by the Air Ministry in 1941, neither Dowding nor Park were mentioned by name, an omission that necessitated Churchill's intervention to rectify. Dowding worked on his own account of the Battle of Britain, a book he titled 12 Legions of Angels, but the book was not published until 1946 due to concerns that the information contained within it would be valuable to the Germans. Dowding was officially retired from the RAF on October 1, 1941, but at the end of the month, Churchill requested him to assess whether it was feasible to reduce RAF personnel who might be more effectively utilized in other war-related work, now that the Battle of Britain was largely concluded. His recommendations resulted in almost 25,000 individuals being reallocated, further alienating him from the Air Ministry and RAF. By June 1942, Dowding had no desire to remain in his post and retired permanently in July 1942 after over 40 years of military service. King George VI proposed promoting Dowding to the rank of Marshal of the Royal Air Force, but this unprecedented royal recommendation was rejected by the Air Ministry. Following his retirement, Dowding commenced writing opinion pieces on aviation matters in national newspapers and continued to harbor fears of the Luftwaffe launching another attack on Britain with more advanced aircraft at a time when the Hurricane was already becoming outdated. In April 1943, Dowding relinquished a ceremonial role he had been granted as King George's principal aide-de-camp. The following month, he accepted an offer of a noble title from Churchill, becoming Baron Dowding of Bentley Priory. For the remainder of his life, Dowding developed an increasing interest in spiritualism and authored 4 books on the subject between 1943 and 1951. He asserted that he was in constant communication with his deceased wife, Clarice, and that he had received messages from airmen killed during the Battle of Britain. Dowding acknowledged that his beliefs were unconventional, but hoped they could offer solace to bereaved families. Dowding's spiritual beliefs led him to meet Muriel Whiting, the widow of an RAF flight engineer who had been killed in action in 1944. Despite a considerable age gap, the couple shared numerous interests and married on September 25, 1951. Under Muriel's influence, Dowding ceased hunting, adopted vegetarianism, and advocated for the humane treatment of animals in the House of Lords. In March 1958, Dowding was designated Life President of the Battle of Britain Fighter Association. He made regular appearances at the memorial service in Westminster Abbey commemorating Battle of Britain Day, observed annually on September 15th, to mark one of the days in the autumn of 1940, when Dowding's fighter units had inflicted particularly heavy casualties on the Luftwaffe in the skies over England. However, his health was deteriorating, and in 1961, he fractured his hip while skiing. He suffered from arthritis and gradually lost his eyesight, making his final public appearance at the London premiere of the 1969 film Battle of Britain, featuring Laurence Olivier as Dowding, where he received a standing ovation from the audience, including many former RAF airmen. On February 15, 1970, 2 months before his 88th birthday, Hugh Dowding passed away at his residence in Tunbridge Wells in Kent. He was cremated, and on March 12th, his ashes were interred in the RAF chapel in Westminster Abbey. Despite their past disagreements, Douglas Bader penned an obituary in The Guardian declaring that Dowding surely earned his place alongside Nelson and Wellington and other great military names in our history. In October 1988, Dowding was further honored with the unveiling of a statue in his likeness in front of St. Clement Danes on the Strand in London, which has served as the RAF's central church since 1958. It was a fitting tribute to the man who, despite his modest flying skills, had played a pivotal role in constructing an integrated air defense system to protect Britain from invasion in 1940. Dowding had not only played a crucial part in the invention of radar and the production of Hurricanes and Spitfires, but he had also persuaded the British government to prioritize air defense over offensive operations, contradicting established RAF doctrine. He had resisted political pressure to sacrifice his fighters for minimal gain during the Battle of France, and throughout the Battle of Britain, he ensured the country was defended from all directions, while maintaining complete confidence in Keith Park's capability to respond to each successive wave of enemy attack over the English Channel. While Dowding was unable to shield London from nighttime raids, his successors did not achieve significantly better outcomes. Had it not been for Dowding's forthrightness and his willingness to challenge RAF dogma, he might not have possessed the resources necessary to defeat the Luftwaffe. But this stance generated numerous adversaries within the RAF and contributed to his demotion. Despite the personal favor of Churchill and King George, he was not accorded the recognition his supporters believed he merited until after his death. Today, he is rightly acknowledged as one of the preeminent British heroes of the Second World War. What are your reflections on Hugh Dowding? Was he the individual who made the most substantial contribution to Britain's survival from German invasion in 1940? Should he have received greater acknowledgement and honors during his lifetime? Or was the Air Ministry justified in removing him from fighter command? Please share your thoughts in the comment section. And in the meantime, we extend our sincere gratitude for watching.